husband living in a remote desert palace during a sandstorm, planning his escape with his mistress. And yes, I said it to the border guard like I was reciting a weather report, because when your mouth is dry enough you can pass any truth as fact. I'm Lola, 33, a field logistics coordinator for an international aid org, which mostly means I've spent the last decade persuading trucks to become boats and meetings to become bridges and men with radios to stop acting like they're kings of small kingdoms, and none of that training prepared me for the minute my marriage turned into a mirage I could walk right through. It was the wind that told me first, which feels dramatic, but it's practical if you grew up where sand has opinions. We were stationed 3 hours from the old trade road, a place where the dunes blurred into pale ribs by noon. My team had set up a water point and 2 shade tents for travelers thrown off course by the season's edge. Bad rains upriver meant the wadis never got their turn to breathe, and people who trusted old maps were coming up against new thirst. I'd done supply counts, checked the satellite phone, labeled everything in English and Arabic in my own handwriting, and then there was this wind. Not a normal one. It whistled under the tent flaps like teeth. It smelled like copper and memory. I stood there with my clipboard tucked under my arm and knew we had 2 hours before the air picked up fistfuls of the ground. Close early, I told Samir, who could move a pallet with one hand and shame a bureaucrat with the other. I'll handle the north pump. Get everyone to the trucks. What about you? She asked. I'm going to follow a lie, I said, and I didn't realize until I heard myself what I meant. The lie had started as a credit card charge on our joint account for a boutique hotel called Casa al Mioj. I'd laughed when I saw it because the name translates to something like Palace of Ascent, and I assumed it was a dumb pop-up in Marrakesh trying to sell rooftop sunsets. Then there was a second charge, then a third, each time the day after my husband Armin supposedly took a survey flight out to check on a wind farm proposal he'd been consulting on. The wind farm company didn't pay hotel tabs on the side. I knew this because I had lunch with their accountant once and she told me in an affectionate way that wind men think receipts are optional, but even they wouldn't cover a place that didn't exist on any legal registry. I asked him casually about the hotel. He smiled like he'd found a new setting on his face. Client thing, he said. Outpost rendezvous. The site is extreme. They built one of those ridiculous compounds for fancy investors to feel adventurous without suffering. Silk cushions. Sparse diaries. He grinned at his own joke and kissed my forehead, and I thought, okay, so one of those places. I've slept in worse, I've worked in better. I tucked the weirdness into that drawer inside you labeled deal with later and then never open until the smell forces you. But the charges kept landing, and then a delivery confirmation came through to our shared email. Custom flight goggles, desert grade, signed by someone named Layla S. Not me. Not his sister Layla with the I. It was the kind of clerical error that pulls the sheet off the furniture in a long empty room. The next time he packed for a flight, he took a duffel I didn't recognize with a stitched emblem, a stylized falcon over a crescent dune. We'd never been a monogram couple. Symbols are masks. I helped him zip the bag anyway, and when he turned away I pressed my fingertips to the embroidery like maybe fabric could confess. So when the wind began to gather its little army and the air turned the color of bruised apricot, I sent Samir and the crew ahead and took the Hilux out past the last acacia stump, following a set of GPS coordinates I'd gotten by triangulating his travel schedule with a handful of gossip and a map with too many coffee rings. The desert was that trick where distance refuses to stay put. Landmarks lied. The sky flattened. My scarf filled with grit until I could chew the alphabet. The truck rattled like it was telling me about all the loose screws it had collected since 1999. I kept going. The palace rose like a hallucination when the wind finally let me have 100 meters of clarity at once. Not a fairytale palace with minarets, not exactly. More like a modernist apology for one. Pale walls cut straight out of the dune, geometry turned fortress, angles that could catch a shadow and hold it. A glass ribbon of a walkway lifted above the sand like a question no one dared to answer. On one side sat a runway, the short kind that says we belong to the sky more than we belong to the ground. A little plane lounged there like a cat. The whole thing looked dropped, not built, as if someone had summoned a catalog of money and pointed. I parked in the lee of a service wall and let the engine tick itself back into silence. The sandstorm had arrived, the horizon gone, the sound a roar like 1,000 brooms. I wrapped my scarf higher and went to the service door because someone with taste had designed the front entrance to be drama, and I did not have room in my body for drama that wasn't mine. Inside was cool and wrong. The air was curated. The silence was the expensive kind. Past olive trees and urns that looked embarrassed, a hallway opened to a central courtyard, and there he was, my husband, laughing with a woman under a canvas shade. The canvas was the color of new bones. The woman's hair was pulled into a scarf that didn't have to be practical. Her hand lay on his knee like her claim had a deed. Her laugh bent toward his mouth. He was not in our life. He was in a rehearsal for one he'd been practicing long enough to forget it wasn't opening night. I didn't call his name the way movies demand. I walked over like I was in our kitchen fetching salt. He looked up and his face did that thing where all the muscles fire at once and cancel each other out. The woman's eyes went quick and narrow, not mean, assessing the way hyenas assess, is this going to be work? Hello, I said in a voice I have used with customs officers who think paperwork is a personality. I like what you've done with the apocalypse. He opened his mouth and changed his mind 3 times. Finally, Lola. Yes, I said. That is me. The woman stood. I'm Layla, she said, like she was handing me a menu with the prices hidden. Up close she was the kind of beautiful people describe with an adjective that implies ownership, polished, groomed, gleaming. It's an illusion, the desert peels us all. But she had money's version of desert-proofing, shade, water, time. I know, I said. You sign for goggles. Armand shut his eyes like maybe kindness would arrive if he invited darkness. Can we, he started. Talk. I finished, cheerfully. Yes, darling. We can always talk. But maybe during a sandstorm is an especially honest time, don't you think? Layla's mouth twitched at the word honest. She glanced at the glass walkway. Beyond it the sky had gone from apricot to the color of an old bruise. We should go inside, she suggested. This courtyard will fill. Let it, I said, and then immediately added because I am a logistics person and cannot allow a preventable mess, fine. Lead the way. They took me into a room colder than money should permit. Low couches, a coffee tray arranged by someone who thinks sugar cubes are personalities, a wall projecting the weather like it was a show. The little plane's tail number rolled in a corner ticker as if the storm had sponsored it. Before you begin, I said, holding up a finger like a schoolteacher who has loved too many impossible students, you need to know what I already know. I know you've been charging this place for 3 months. I know you used my name to book the first visit because you were curious how that would feel. I know there's a woman signing for deliveries who is not me. I know when you say flight you mean here. I tilted my head toward the runway. I don't know what you plan to do when the storm clears, and I'd like you to tell me without inventing a tragedy you think will make me forgive you. He looked at me the way men look at tents in high winds, like maybe a pole will snap and kill them, maybe it will hold and kill them later. He said, quiet, I was going to leave. So boring, I said. Not because it wasn't devastating, because devastation dresses itself as novelty and I refused to applaud it. Where? North, Layla said, stepping into the confession like it was a phone call she could put on speaker. We have a corridor over the ridge where the wind breaks. Then to the coast. Then Malta. You have a we, I said, tasting the math. So this is not a fling where people will arrive at your door in 6 months with thank you fruit baskets. Layla did not blush, which I respected and resented. No, she said. Armand's expertise is transferable. They'll want him. I want him, but this is not personal alone. It's design. I keep a spare laugh in my pocket for when someone says a quiet thing too loudly. I imagine everything looks like design in a room where someone irons your pillow. She sat, folded, perfectly symmetrical, like her body had practiced before I arrived. You're angry, she said. Of course. But you're also curious. That's the only reason you could find this place in a storm. I was. I hate that about myself. I am a woman who will pause on the way to divorce to admire a good staircase. I reached for a date from the tray and realized my hand was shaking, so I waved the date like a truce. How did you build this? I asked. Who permits a runway in a dune field? People who don't need permits, she said frankly. We lease from a holding company. The runway is temporary in a way steel can pretend. Investors come in by small plane when the wind is sleeping. We sell an experience. The storm is an upsell. She gestured at the weather projection. Tonight is good for business. Business, I repeated. The word felt like a dead moth. And you? I turned to Armin. What were you going to do with my grandmother's rug you insisted we bring to the apartment and then rolled without asking? He flinched. I was going to send for your things when it was safe. I put both hands flat on my thighs the way my therapist taught me when anger tries to convert my fists without consent. You know I build bridges out of arguments for a living, I said. We could have kept the rug and lost the business deal. You chose business first. You made my life the weather. Now I have to decide whether to be a tourist in it. Layla stood and moved toward a control panel that dimmed the windows. It made me want to slap her in a way that startled me. What do you want? She asked over her shoulder, not flicking her gaze at me like I was a mosquito, actually asking. I surprised myself by answering honestly. Information, I said, because love never killed my appetite for fact. Explain the plane. Explain the palace. Explain the corridor over the ridge. Explain why my husband thinks he can reinvent the shape of his life in a storm because the air agrees to look holy. So they did, and I listened as if minutes were water. The plane was leased to a name that won't suffer consequences. The palace was a test site for a desert hospitality project for people who like risk in a controlled environment. The corridor over the ridge was a route old smugglers used to move things that money and war wanted permanently elsewhere. Layla had reproposed it with bribes and gravitas. Armin fixed what the storm broke and designed what the guests never saw, the redundancies, the quiet machines that keep rich people from learning certain words like ration. He loved it. I could hear it in his verbs. The work was his mirror. He saw himself whole here. And loving himself whole next to a woman who looked at him like he was a map, well, those are potent ingredients. You were going to go, I said again, because saying it hammering makes it true in structure. Without coming home to make your mouth do the decent work. He looked at the floor. I hate hurting you, he said. The oldest sentence. The one that should come with a tax. I hated the life we had begun to build too, he added, and I had to physically sit on my hands to keep from applauding the honesty. It felt like a series of small weather reports. I wanted a storm. You're not a kite, I said, almost tender. You're a man. Storms lift and drop. People have to climb. The power faltered then, a little hiccup of light that went and came back with a shudder. Layla's head snapped toward the panel. Generator 3, she said, and then into the radio clipped to her belt. Tarek now. The storm outside growled the way big animals do when a smaller one forgets its place. Someone ran past the door, a flash of flight suit and urgency. Do you need me? Armin asked, half standing, and I watched the way Layla wanted to say yes and the way she chose not to in front of me. We have it, she said. Stay with your wife. The word slapped the air and then laid down between us, panting. While they dealt with Generator 3, we stood near the window and watched the world sand itself. It would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so rude. A line of lanterns along the runway flickered against the wind like they'd been commanded by a small god. The little plane bent a wing in complaint and righted itself. In the glass I could see our reflections, me scarfed and steadier than I felt, him handsome and haunted, behind us a room that could hold an entire afternoon of arguments in its couches. What now? He asked, and I almost laughed because the easiest answer, the simplest selfish one, was to say, now you choose me or her. As if love were a button hidden under glass. But I've done evacuations where that kind of binary thinking sends people to bad places. I know constraint more intimately than I know fantasy. What now is always a list. You get to decide if you want to be the kind of man who leaves in a weather window, I said. If yes, you go when the wind drops. You take your bag and your courage and your talent and you leave. And when you miss your grandmother's rug in my hands and the way I make tea, you write to me and I decide if the archive accepts submissions. If no, you walk me out of here when it's safe and we go home and we make a boring, strong plan for unmaking what you've done. You send Layla a letter with your thanks and your boundaries, and you don't do that thing where you try to keep a friendship as a souvenir. You sit in our kitchen while I eat dates and ask you the same question 300 ways and you answer all 300. And you apply your genius to a life that includes me in the design phase, not as a last-minute change order. I gestured at the storm. Either way, you do not wait for the wind to choose for you. He nodded like a student who finally found the paragraph that made the problem make sense. And what do you want? He asked, and that's when I knew maybe he had not killed everything that mattered. I want to be a woman who walks herself out of palaces, I said. I want to not become a person who gathers storms to prove I'm worth it. I want my job to stay mine and my dignity to stay paid up. I want you to remind me that the first thing I fell in love with about you was not your capacity for dramatic reinvention. It was the way you remembered the names of my drivers. And the way you adjusted the truck mirrors before you drove at dawn even when it was just to pick up bread. He laughed then, helplessly, and that relieved me more than it should have. I remember, he said. The mirrors squeaked. You swore at them in 3 languages. 4, I corrected, and wiped my eyes with the heel of my palm in a gesture I only allow myself alone or in sandstorms. Layla came back, steady again. Generator 3 apologizes, she said. We accept. She looked at Armin. The window opens in 40 minutes. After that, we're sleeping with the planes till morning. He looked at me, then at her, then back. He had the grace to look terrified. He started, and any sentence that begins with I deserves patience. I'm not going, he said. To her. To me. To the little plane. I'm going home with my wife. Layla's face became a piece of brilliant architecture with a hairline crack you'd only see at sunset. She nodded once, the way leaders do when their options are what they are. Understood, she said. She didn't add a curse, she didn't add a plea. She did the most adult thing I've ever seen a lover do in a room like that. She turned to me and said, Get him out. The Eastern Service Road is better in this wind. Then she reached into a drawer and handed me a pair of goggles. Keep them, she said. They're paid for. We walked. The palace groaned politely. The corridor she'd nodded to was a seam in the back wall. Armin carried nothing. I carried my keys and the radio I'd stolen from work without realizing. At the service door we paused because stories like gratitude. I faced her. You don't need my blessing, I said. But you have something like my respect. Not for the taking of him. For the running of your ship in a storm. She nodded. When you're less on fire, if you ever want to consult on our supply chain, call me, she said. We're bad at beans. Everyone's bad at beans, I said, and for a second we were just 2 women who hate inventory. The storm received us like a country. The Hilux was half-buried, sullen. We dug like children at the beach. Sand got into my teeth and we'll be renting space there for the next decade. Armin took the driver's seat and I let him because forgiveness is not a lane change but you can practice. We crawled east along the service track, then north where the ground firmed to that packed stubborn salt. The windshield wipers did nothing but looked busy. For times I told him to angle against a drift and 4 times he listened, and you'd be surprised how much that matters. At the first radio range I called Samir. I'm coming in from the east, I said. All heads. All tents. All heads, all tents, all patience, she said. Your face. Sanded, I said. We'll need to deliver tomorrow. The caravan camp near the old fort sheltered in place. We'll run water at dawn. Copy, she said, and then softer off-duty. You okay, boss? No, I said. But I'm not being stupid. When we reached our compound, the storm had de-escalated into a tantrum instead of a divorce. I rinsed sand out of my nose for 10 minutes and watched Armin make tea like a pilgrim. We sat on our grandmother's rug and I asked him all the hard questions and he answered, sometimes badly, sometimes like a man asking for his own life. He slept on the couch for a month. We scheduled a therapist over dodgy video. He wrote a letter to Layla that I read before he sent, and he did not whine in it. He thanked her for the work and said he can't be a man who calls himself brave in the clouds and a coward at ground level. She replied with 2 lines, "Thank you. Be useful." He is now. Not magically. He comes to the water point and fixes the pump without narrating his genius. He checks the truck mirrors. We still fight, and sometimes I hate his face for reminding me of dust, but then he goes out at 4 a.m. to intercept a truck whose driver fell asleep 6 kilometers back, and he comes home with bread. A month later, a package arrives, a crate of ration-grade beans and a note on thick paper. From Layla. "Your first consulting fee," it says. "Teach me how to move food without moving men's egos." I send her a spreadsheet and the dignity of an invoice. Sometimes the wind picks up in the evening and the horizon goes vague, and I stand outside and listen, and I remember a palace that is absolutely real and absolutely not mine, and I am not drawn to it. I am drawn to the list on my clipboard and the pump that sighs when it's happy and Samir's voice on the radio and my husband's stupid careful mirror adjustments. If you want a moral, you should probably talk to a different storm. I have a maintenance schedule. I have a pair of goggles that do not belong to me and do not belong to her, they belong to the desert. I keep them in the truck. I make tea. I label things. I ask for the truth in the slow voice, the one that makes men answer the first time. And when someone asks me if I've ever seen a palace in a sandstorm, I say yes, and then I tell them where the Eastern Service Road is, because whatever else I am a woman who will get you home.